All right. Should have it on the screen now. Okay. We're on page 20. I sent you an updated file. I'm working on two or three real important points of logic, and I'm trying to get them into the book in the next week or so. And so I may be giving you another copy of the book in about 2 weeks. Sent one yesterday, I believe it was. We're looking at types of propositions, and there are two basic types of arguments by propositions we're talking about, with statements that are either true or false. And they can be subdivided into two basic categories. There are some that are self-supporting propositions a priori, that's Latin. Well, look at the meaning of that, Levin. From the former, this expression used an antonym, the opposite of empirical. Empirical is based upon experience. This related to derived from self-evident propositions. A priori, knowledge is knowledge not derived from experience. You didn't get it from experience. Now, science is based upon experience. And some of you were in my flood class, and those that weren't, I can send you the link to it. I had, I think, 75 lessons on the flood. And I am revising my first edition of my flood book. I'm not really changing the material that's in it. I'm just adding material to it. And so supplementing with more information. We have self-supporting propositions and supported propositions. That is, we have to put more than one piece of information together to draw the conclusion for the second one. We generally accept, however, as truthful self-reports of people. For example, when Paul wrote, "For I long to see you," in Romans 1:11, we generally take that on face value as it's written. And so that's face value. We take it on face value. So we generally accept that. Some propositions are true because of their logical structure. Just because their logical structure, they're true. For example, we've already given it the principle of the excluded middle. We know that the statement, because of that principle, we know that either God exists or God does not exist is true. That is a true statement, because that entails all the possibilities. Either God exists or God does not exist, and no third option. And because the principle of the excluded middle, or sometimes called the law of excluded middle, and from the principle of non-contradiction, or we know that God both exists and God does not exist. He both exists and does not exist is false, because that's a contradictory statement. It can't be true. It can't be true that it's both exists and does not exist also. And so that statement, a statement that is true by its logical structure, is a tautology. That's a term that's used. You'll see that term in various writings around. So that's what it is. Any statement that is true because of its logical structure is tautology. And right here, either God exists or God does not exist is a tautology. It's a statement that's true. But it's important that we understand that. Later, we're going to apply other principles of logic as we learn them to prove other propositions to be true. That is, to be tautologies, or perhaps to be false. Some propositions, remember the proposition is a statement that is either true or false by its very nature. And so, by definition, they're self-supporting. For instance, all rectangles are four-sided figures is true by definition. That's just the nature. A rectangle is a four-sided figure. Now, we're not saying you can turn that around and say all four-sided figures are rectangles, because they're not. Okay, you could have a parallelogram that's four-sided. So we don't necessarily have, we could have other figures that are four-sided, and they wouldn't necessarily be rectangles. But a rectangle is four-sided. It's a subset. It's one thing that's four-sided. A parallelogram could be four-sided as well. And by nature, they are. right? Another proposition, all rectangles are circles, is false by definition. So by definition, it's a false statement to say all rectangles are circles. You can't, that's not true. It can't be true. Because by definition, they define each other out of being possible. They cannot be equal by that because of the definition. Atheists will sometimes try to be cute when they ask, is God able to make a square circle? Well, that's not possible. By definition, it cannot be possible. And or can God create a rock that's too big for him to lift or something to that effect? You'll hear that stated. And again, they're just kind of sophomoric in their approach to things. Some propositions must be supported by evidence external to the proposition to be proved to be the true or false. And there are only two sources of this evidence, according to 2 Corinthians 5:7. For we walk by faith, not by sight. So it's either by faith or by sight, and then we're going to hopefully get into the definition of faith tonight, because this will be important to us. These two sources are faith and sight. Sight is empirical evidence, and you have to sense it with one or more of your five senses. We gain empirical evidence, and now we have the Latin words a posteriori, so we'll go down and define it at the bottom. A posteriori is from the latter, the expression is linked with inductive reasoning or reasoning from observed facts, and the scientific method is used in that. Now, a fortiori, let's go back to it. A fortiori is from the former. So it's from the former, and a priori knowledge is not derived by experience, right? I know that a circle is not a square by definition. I didn't learn that by experience. I learned it by definition. So we gain empirical or knowledge through our senses, a posteriori information or evidence by either formally or informally employing the scientific method. So the scientific method, we use it to gain knowledge from our senses. And sometimes that can be used formally or informally, right? A child sticks his hand into a warm stove or a hot stove and he gets it burnt. But he knows that if I stick my hand up there and his hand gets close to the burner and he feels the heat of it, he can know it's going to be hot. So he now can associate that with being burnt. Right? Now let's look at faith. Now, I've said there's two ways we know things, faith and sight. We talked about empirical knowledge. I want to go, before I get in too far into it, let's go back down here to number 13. The scientific method is discussed extensively in the second edition of my book on the biblical flood. And I went through that in a series of lessons that are up on YouTube. And also in chapter 12. Now, if you're in this class, I think I sent you that flood book. If I didn't send it to you, let me know, and I'll send you an electronic copy of it. All right. Now, what I'm saying is that is one way of knowing things. And we dealt with that kind of information in that book and also in those classes, those 75 lessons we had on that. Now, let's see what we gain by faith. It's not most unfortunate, that is, that many people discredit faith as a means of knowing truth. Now, most people in the United States use the word faith for something they think, assume, or suppose to be true, but they're not certain of it. People say, I believe, when they really mean I think, I assume, or I suppose. And that's not how the Bible uses it. And that's most unfortunate. In fact, most of what we know is based upon faith. I know there's a city in India that used to be called Bombay. The modern name is Mumbai. I know there's a country in the world called Japan, but I've never been there. But I know it exists because I've seen too much evidence that it exists. I know there's another country called China. I've never been there. I could go on and on. There's a lot of things that I know, but I have never experienced them. I haven't seen them. I haven't heard them, tasted, touched. I have not experienced them with one or more of my five senses. But I still am confident they're real. Now, it is by faith that I know that George Washington was the first president of the United States under our Constitution. Abraham Lincoln was the president during our Civil War. I know all of this, but I don't know it by science. I don't know it by empirical means. I don't know it by my senses. So it's unsound to assert that we cannot know by faith. And yet the atheist has gained that advantage over us by defining us out of the discussion, defining faith out of the discussion. And we'll look at how faith is actually defined in dictionaries today. It's unsound to assert that one cannot know by faith. Faith entails, according to the Bible, it's defined for us by the Bible. The examination of the evidence for the credibility of the witnesses or the testimony that you received that caused you to have the faith. It means, do you know Abraham Lincoln was president of the United States of America? I don't know it by empirical means, by one of your five senses, but by some other means. You know it by faith. That is, you can examine the evidence that he was president. For faith is the evidence, Hebrews 11:1. So kind of keep this in mind. It's based upon evidence. Faith is the evidence of things hoped for. If you look with me in that passage, we'll look at it. King James says evidence. The American Standard says faith is assurance of things hoped for, a conviction of things not seen. So the King James words are a little bit different, but if you put the two verses together, you can get a very clear picture of it. The English Revised Version, not the English Standard Version, English Revised, it was translated around 1890 or 1880, has it Hebrews 11:1 as faith is what makes real things real, the things we hope for. It is proof of what we cannot see. That's kind of a free translation, but it gets the point across. Brother Thomas Warren, I don't agree with everything he taught, but Brother Thomas Warren proves that faith does not mean that acceptance of position cannot be proved. Brother Warren had 3 powerful debates with atheists, and I believe he devastated them every time he debated them. And those 3 debates are in print, very worthy of being listened to. They're also on tape as well. He's passed away several years ago. Warren discusses extensively the nature of biblical faith in his book that I write here, that I cite here in 1982. Even the pragmatist, Miller is his name, he wrote, and he's a pragmatist, and he's basically he claimed to be a Christian, but I was in his class studying philosophy of education under him at doctoral level, and he was everything but a Christian, okay? The point is that faith is one way of knowing truth, as he put that in his book. And I couldn't believe he had that in there, but he had it in there. One's knowledge of history is based upon knowledge of not gained by empirical means. Now, Cohen and Nagel, the past can be reached in only 2 ways. This is a graduate level research book for doing research, historical research and other kinds of research. So the past can be reached in only 2 ways, either through the personal memory of the historian or through the interpretation of objects as remains of past events. So if the historian goes back prior to the time when he's born, he can't use his personal memory. He has to go to other things, other information, objects as remains of past events, writings and archaeological evidence and other stuff. Isaac and Michael, both of these books, Cohen and Nagel and Isaac and Michael, are for research, for graduate level research in college. And the purpose of historical research, according to them, is to reconstruct the past objectively and accurately, often in relation to the tenability of a hypothesis. So again, that's used in the graduate school. These research books are. This is the same method to determine truth used in a courtroom. It's called prima facie evidence in the courtroom. And that, of course, is legally sufficient to establish a fact or a case unless disproved. That's what that means. That's prima facie evidence. Any area of science that deals with things that cannot be either reproduced in the laboratory or observed in nature is based upon statistical inference. So now we get into statistics for this. But statistics only deals with what is probably true and it cannot be certain. So we don't have certainty in statistics. Now, Robb, an atheist, wrote that geology and paleontology is the study of fossils, are historical sciences, and that these sciences rely largely on statistical inference. Both geologists and paleontologists deal and must look at the artifacts and then form a hypothesis to explain them. And they'll likely be biased by their worldview. Either their worldview will be either theistic, atheistic, or agnostic. One of those worldviews will frame how they interpret the data. Our worldview, that's how we view things, will affect how we view the evidence. And it can channel our views, our thoughts in a certain direction. In many instances, the evidence could lead to more than one conclusion. Now, for example, I developed an alternative model for an explanation of most geological phenomena in my book of 2000 on the biblical flood. And I'm revising that book, adding more information, more to it, and not changing the thrust of that book, but just adding more information. So we'll not delve into that. I dealt with it in the lectures and in the book that I have. And you all have that book, electronic format at least. The revised copy is what you have. The proper definition of faith is critical to understanding the arguments set forth by this author in this treatise, in our book, in our course that we're studying right here now. Now, the New Testament was originally written in Greek, and the definition of the Greek word translated faith, pistis, is critical. So let's look at faith as it's defined. Faith is a conviction of the truth of anything or belief. That's thayer. And so that's what it is. It's conviction of the truth. Now, how were we convicted? How were we convinced of the truth of this matter? And that's the question. What is the evidence for it? We've already seen Hebrews 11:1. That's based upon evidence. It's assurance based upon evidence. It's axiomatic. It's self-evident truth that every writer is allowed to define his own terms. Now, certainly, the Bible should be allowed to define its own terms. It's written over 2,000 years ago, completed. So the writer of the book of Hebrews defines faith for the reader. Now let's look at it. In Hebrews 11:1, the American Standard says, now we'll look at these two verses. Now, these two translations, that is. Now, faith is assurance of things hoped for. So we have assurance, American Standard Version, 1901 edition, of things hoped for, a conviction of things not seen. Now, the King James Version says now faith is the substance. So it uses the word substance. So there's substance to it that gives you assurance, things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. We have conviction or evidence, right? If a person is truly convicted in a court of law, there should have been evidence to support, sufficient evidence to show his guilt. So evidence and conviction go together. Now let's look at the Greek word translated conviction here in the American Standard, evidence in the King James. Elenkos is the Greek word, elenkos. The verb form of this word is elenko. That's elenko right here. Trench reveals some valuable information about these words. Now, I'm going to read this. I know it's kind of boring to read it, but you've got to get this clear. This is the definition. Notice it's offset. It's pretty lengthy. One may rebuke a person without convicting that person of any fault. You may rebuke him. You may charge him with fault in it, but not give any evidence, not prove it. In such a case, there was either no fault, in other words, he wasn't guilty of fault, and so the rebuke is unnecessary or unjust, probably unjust and certainly unnecessary, both. Or, although there is fault, and the rebuke does not cause the offender to admit it. You didn't give enough evidence to prove he was guilty. Right? Thus, the distinction between epitemao, and I put the Greek word in here for those that have studied Greek, and elenko, that's our word here. The word we're looking at here in Hebrews 11:1, put the Greek in there, lies in the possibility of rebuking for sin without convicting of sin. Epitemao, right here, this word connotes rebuking and can be used to refer to unjust checking or blaming someone. You can blame them and not even be fair about it. They're not even guilty. Whereas elenko, the word that we find in Hebrews 11:1, is a much more pregnant word. It's full of meaning. See what it means there. It means to rebuke another with the truth so that the person confesses or is at least convicted of his sin. Now, he cites Job 5:17 and Proverbs 19:25, which we won't look at. I'll let you study those on your own. This is also the case of juristic Greek. That's in a court. Juristic's in a court, where elenko, that's our word here, is not merely to reply to, but to refute an opponent. You refute him. You actually just refute his position, right? The difference between epitemao and elenko can shed a great deal of light on many New Testament passages. So when you see these two words, you need to look at them from a different standpoint. Epitemao, you can falsely accuse somebody, but not with elenko, right? And now there's a similar difference in meaning between aiteia. Now, aiteia is from the same root as the same idea, at least, and elenkos. Aiteia refers to an accusation that may be true or false. So it could be true or false. But elenkos, that's our word here. This is the noun form of our word. However, he says, refers to an accusation that is true. It's always true. It often implies an inward and outward acknowledgement of truthfulness on the part of the accused. The accused person frequently acknowledges his guilt. Thus, elenkos, that's not necessarily an accusation of guilt, of wrongdoing. It could be that one is accused of doing good. It would be true. It would be a true statement. Elenkos represents the glorious prerogative of truth in its highest operation, not merely to silence the adversary, but to convince him of his error. So faith is based upon evidence that's convincing evidence. That's what he's saying. Elenkai, and that's a verb form of this word, elenko, it depicts the business of a teacher, now getting into teaching, who points out the truth that so far has not been recognized for the persuasion, even of the person repressing it, so that he is compelled to surrender. See, elenkos is found there in Hebrews 11:1 is a word that carries the idea there's no doubt about it. There's no doubt about it. The word elenkos then is a predicate nominative in Hebrews 11:1, revealing that faith is based upon, or more literally, it's the same as absolute proof. So faith is the same as elenkos. It's equal to it. These two are equal. It is absolute proof of something. Any questions, comments here about that? That's what faith is by definition. Now then, I'm going to give you Merriam-Webster's definition of it. This definition of faith is considerably different than the current definition of faith by many English-speaking people that they would give. The English word faith is defined as it is currently used in our society, not as it's defined in the Bible. So the English word faith has a different meaning by most people than it does in the Bible. Now, even some members of the church, many members of the church, I've even run into preachers that don't understand the meaning of the word faith. All right. Here's what Merriam-Webster says. This is one of the latest editions of it. You can find this on the internet. Firm belief in something for which there is no proof. That's Merriam-Webster's definition of faith. Now, he's got several definitions of it. This is one of his definitions. Unfortunately, this dictionary gives the current manner that the word faith is used by English-speaking people in the United States. It does not give the biblical definition of the word faith. It doesn't give the biblical definition of the word faith. It gives how it's used by people on the street. Atheists and agnostics then use that definition. That is, what definition? Something, firm belief in something for which there's no proof. So belief to them is something you're not certain of. That's what faith is. Atheists and agnostics will use that to brush aside or ignore any discussion from the scriptures. They say something like, that's just about religion. And everybody knows it's just a matter of faith. That is something for which there's no proof. So by definition, they've defined us out of the discussion. And they've gotten by with it. We haven't challenged them. And brethren are not challenging them. That's a shame. We need to challenge them on every hand. Know and be able to define and prove what faith really is. The definition of the English word faith has changed over time. It formerly meant, now I have a 1965 dictionary, which is several years ago. Here's what it meant in 1965 in my dictionary. The assent of the mind to the truth of what is declared by another, firm and earnest belief on probable evidence of any kind. Well, that's pretty close to the Bible definition. 1965, when I graduated college with my bachelor's degree, that was the correct, pretty close to the correct Bible definition. But it's sure not the definition today. See how things have changed? Remember, English is a living language. Words change meaning over time. When I was young, the word gay meant happy. Today, it means homosexual. Words change meaning. Scriptures should be allowed to give their own definition of every word in the scriptures, including the word faith. Even works of men, such as Shakespeare, have lexicons that define the words they use. Any questions about faith now? What it's all about? All right. Now, this gets us into the idea of the problem of defining words. Sometimes issues hinge on the definition of the word. And there's a whole lot that hinges on the definition of the word faith. So I spent so much time defining it. I'm convinced that once we can get people to see what faith is really all about, they might be more open to listening to the truth. Now, why is it important to define terms that we're going to be used in our studies? Now, here's a book that I found very valuable. It's Martin and Owen, Logic and Rhetoric of Exposition is the name of the book. And I've cited it here, and there's a bibliography in our book here. And in that bibliography, you can find it. It's very valuable. If you can find a copy of it, it's very useful. One of the paradoxes, all right, paradox, something that doesn't seem like it can be true. It's strange. It's not what you normally see of learning, is that the beginner must accept much before he can understand anything. Okay. One of the things we have to know is the definition of words. One of the most central of our givens are words themselves and their meaning. I'm going to illustrate with my son. When he was in the 5th grade, we lived in Mountain View, Oklahoma, where I preached, and he was in kindergarten. So when we sent him to kindergarten, the school was about a half a block south of the main highway running through the town from the church building. My office was there, and my window looked out. And so I knew when he got out of class, he was told not to walk across the street, and I would come and get him and walk him across, because there was trucks that went through there speeding, and 35-mile-per-hour speeding, but they'd be going 60 or 70 through the town. Not 70, but they'd be running well over the speed limit, and they were loaded down with gravel and everything. They couldn't stop for any reason. And so I did, but the elementary school was on the southeast corner of the block, and on the northeast corner was the First Baptist Church. So my son asked me one day, he said, Dad, he said, why would anyone go to the Baptist church? And see, he didn't understand the term Baptist. Now, he had heard about baptizing, but I hadn't used the word Baptist very much in my preaching. And so he hadn't picked it up. He thought it was Baptist, Baddest. And I explained to him, I said, oh, I see now. And so we talked about the Baptist church. But you see, he didn't have the meaning of that word, so he substituted another word that kind of sounded like it. He made up a word. Baptist is not even an English word. But people will do that with you, and they substitute it in, they get a completely wrong impression of what's going on. So again, it gets back to, we've got to define our terms in order to communicate with people. So let's go back here now. Among the most central of the givens are words themselves and their meaning. Defining, therefore, far from being a sterile academic exercise, is a necessary preliminary to writing, and I would say not only to writing, but to speaking as well, even when the final draft will contain no definitions. You need to be sure you got all your terms properly defined. You're using the term correctly in your writings or in your speech. Now, it's not necessary to define words over and over, but sometimes you have to define the word in order to get the point across. Many undertakings, so much hangs on the meaning of the words, the definition had best be brought out in the open. If you're going to study baptism, you better understand what baptism is, because there's wrong definitions of it out there, just as we showed a moment ago, the wrong definition of faith. When we speak on faith, belief in faith, belief is just the verb form of the word faith. In the Greek, it is. And when we speak on it, we need to make sure the audience understands what it's all about, because they've been fed this error as to what it means. Now, I realize it's dry and boring to read the definition of words. I don't think reading a dictionary is the most exciting thing to do you? I don't. However, it's essential that the words that are critical to a proper interpretation of a passage of scripture or of any matter relating to things, and I'm talking about ontological or axiological questions. Ontological is what's real. All right, is God real? How was the earth come about, and how did it come into existence? How did life come into existence? Axiological, what is good, what is evil, and why do we know something is good or evil? Is abortion a sin, for example? Is it wrong? Is it murder? And these are axiological questions. we need to understand that they must be preceded by correct definition of the terms, so we can all be on the same wavelength. We're talking the same thing. Martin and Ullman, while discussing definitions, state, and they say here, and indeed, the call for definition can be tedious, question-begging, and sophistical. Not every dilemma will be solved or resolved by clarification of terms, but clarity of terms is essential in every important argument. Definitions offers a powerful means of brushing away intellectual cobwebs. Sometimes it clears the matter up. I've had several debates, and a large portion of the time, the debate hinged on definitions. And you had to have the definition straight, especially in problems of classification. Definition is a prerequisite, Barton and Owen say. One of the main problems in either ontology or axiology is a matter of classification. Let's look at just abortion, for example. If you're going to discuss abortion, you need to define, when does life begin? What is life? When does it begin? And what is murder? See, you get into definitions now. For example, a discussion on ontological question at the beginning of life, we get into discussion of organic evolution. Now, most people don't understand what evolution means. When they hear the word evolution, they don't know that there's two kinds of evolution. There's microevolution and there's macroevolution. And there's a difference in them. I believe in microevolution because what it basically says is God placed in microevolution doesn't say this, but my interpretation of it is that God placed within the genes of animals and plants and even humans ability on certain limited ways to adapt to their environment. And this right here helped them survive. And I would point out to you that tomatoes, for example, have different forms. There are a number of plants that have different forms. Like the cotton plant, there are trees that will actually grow cotton. And so they're perennials. And the cotton that's grown in the cotton fields in the southern United States is just an annual plant. It grows one year and dies, has to be reseeded. But there are just a small number of cotton seeds from these cotton plants that turn into trees. They've just discovered that in the past 20 or 30 years. It's a recent discovery. But microevolution occurs. It's within a small category. Macroevolution, amoeba to man, does not occur. All right. Cotton, there's different varieties, different colors of it, different colors of lizards. They get different colors, are born or hatched out. And if the environment is the color, so that one color that hatches out is camouflaged, they'll breed more of them. They'll be the dominant color. But it's in the genes. It was not acquired. It was already there. God put it there. So it's a matter of classification, and it's critical in the study of organic evolution. Micro occurs because God put it in the genes. Macro does not occur. All right. Martin and Ullman classified defining or describing into three broad categories. So the reader may have noticed that under the heading of definition, we have included at least three different sorts of activity. So there's three different sorts of activity. In common parlance, one defines words. That is, he proffers a word or combination of words to serve as the near equivalent of the word in question, plus some rules of usage. And that's sometimes called a gloss, G-L-O-S-S. Definitions of this type are what we know as formal. Philosophers call them nominal. Now, nominal is from the Greek word nomos, to name. Definitions. They place the word to be defined in a proper context. So they'll illustrate it with illustrations. That's what a dictionary will do. Of linguistic conventions in their pure form, they seem to have little to do with the world outside language. So they're just defining how that word is used. On the other hand, the man on the street, when he hears the word existentialism or organism, he's not asking for a verbal stand-in. He wants to know what it really entails in the real world. Existentialism, he wants to know what's the difference between existentialism, for example, and other schools of thought, right? And when he hears the word organism, he wants to know, okay, what's the difference between an organism and another clump or conglomeration of matter? All right, what's the difference between an organism and a rock out there or something like that? He wants a descriptive definition, a real definition, as philosophers would call it, descriptive, to describe it. Now, Martin and Owen go on, the issue is further complicated by the fact that some definitions seem to be of a third type. You can define them a third way. This is important that you remember this because this gets into logic. They point to facts about the meaning associated with the word in someone's mind. So when you're talking to people, sometimes they have in their mind what a word means. And so sometimes you have to remove the improper definition from their thinking, as we did with the word faith earlier. And so these are mentalistic definitions. The average person defines faith the way Merriam-Webster defines it. And that's not correct. That's not the biblical definition of faith. And so we look, Martin and Owen give two other ways to classify, and that's by denotation, and connotation. And denotation, you denote it, you give the name of mother is a female animal parent. All right? That's just pretty sterile definition. But it has a connotative meaning that's different with each person. Because when you hear the word mother, you probably think of your own mother. And that's who you think of. So your view of a mother is your mother, primarily, because that's your experience. So when you're dealing with the scriptures, we should always allow the Bible to establish the connotative meaning of the word as well as the denotative meaning, not just our life experiences. Any Bible word is defined by the context as well as by lexicons. For example, the word mother that we just used refers to a wicked woman in Ezekiel 16:45. And yet it refers to a good woman in Matthew 1:18. The context has to tell you whether she's good or evil. Now, if your mother was a wicked woman, then you see the word woman and that's your first impression. I was told that a young child was brought to Bible classes, and he was invited to Bible classes, but he didn't go anywhere. So children would pick him up, and the parents would take him and bring him to the Bible classes so he could be taught. And so the Bible class teacher was teaching, and he asked, well, what is God like? And she said, oh, he's a father. Well, the other children in the Bible class, they had good fathers, and so they got the impression. But his father abused him, and so he said, I don't want anything to do with him. And immediately, see, his connotative definition was a bad definition of the word father. And so that could be a negative thing. And also the word mother is used for the covenant of the Lord, Galatians 4:26. Again, context. All right. The word mother must be defined, not exclusively defined by the lexicon. Remember, lexicon is, in this case, we're going to use a Greek lexicon probably for the New Testament. It'll be a Hebrew lexicon for the Old Testament. Strong's Concordance would get you both, but also by the context of the scriptures. So you always have to go to context. like we did right here with the word mother. We recognize it'd be wrong to give the word mother the same definition every place it's found. And so if it is, then we need to recognize that any other word might need to be defined that way. But we would argue that the word normally has the same meaning everywhere it's found. But context can limit that meaning or even change it within certain boundaries. We'll be aware of that. So if you claim the word has a different meaning, you need to be able to show it from context. Otherwise, we'd argue that the word will have the same meaning. That's normal. Now we're going to stop here and see if there are any questions. We can pick up here on the next class. Do you have any questions, anybody? Okay.